Hey Astromagic fans, and welcome back for another episode of Magical Elections between our lunations here. We took a little bit of a break for the holidays, and we hope you enjoyed yours as well. But now we're back, and we're going to get more into different magical elections for this lunation period from January 5th to January 20th. So some of you have probably heard, but this lunation is a little bit different from a typical lunation. More specifically, this new moon is actually going to be a solar eclipse. And while eclipses have gotten something of a different reputation in the modern era, it's important to emphasize that eclipses generally are only a source of malefic magic. It's not a good idea to use eclipses to kind of supercharge the general new moon wish fulfillment or intention setting ritual that many individuals utilize. This isn't a very good time for that. Historically, eclipses have always been associated with difficult or malevolent entities. This is like a whole other video of things we can go into, but the general takeaway is that eclipses represent a severance or a cutting off of life force, either from the sun or the moon. So they do not in themselves reflect or show what we might call a good time. Now, the modern sort of New Age Wicca movement has taken and recontextualized a lot of the lunar magic and specifically the eclipse magic from older historical sources and just sort of updated it, changed it, and did what they needed to do with it and came up with what we might call like an alternate tradition. One of the major changes is how they approach eclipses, which they see as sort of supercharged lunations or just much more powerful. It's important to remember that the Wicca movement is only about 80 years old. And even though it claims a lineage much older than that, there's no historical evidence to back that up. But the historical evidence that we do have from sources and texts make it very clear that eclipses are not what we would call good times. So we generally want to stray away from utilizing eclipses in any sort of positive goal magic. It's just not going to be a great time to do that. That's not the best time. There are better times. So if you're going to go ahead and use the eclipse to supercharge something, just please be careful. I can't stop you, but I would implore you to wait for another time. But because this is a solar eclipse, that means it is a new moon, and the new moon is the beginning of the waxing phase of the moon. And when we're dealing with waxing phase moons, we want to talk about growth, increase, borrowing, these kinds of things. We want things to grow, to set in, and to develop. That's really what the waxing moon is about. It's about development and growth, and we're going to see some of that reflected in some of the elections that we're going to utilize today. Oh, you'll think. But before we get started with the elections, I want to take a quick second and sort of check in with all the planets and just kind of see what they're up to and what we can kind of expect from them from a magical perspective. First, we have the moon. Now, the moon is going to, of course, move through half the zodiac from Capricorn to the beginning of Leo in January 20th in time for the Leo full moon. She'll pass through her signs of domicile, Cancer and Taurus. And unfortunately for the moon talismans are actually a little bit more difficult to make than you might think, just because they kind of go really quickly. We tend to have a lot of opportunities for them, of course 2 or 3 every month, but there's always something with moon talismans that get in the way, and this time it's not going to be really any different. While we could potentially use moon magic more forcefully with the moon in Cancer or in Taurus, when the moon will be in Cancer, she'll actually be in opposition to Saturn and Capricorn, and that's just something we're going to have to deal with until April of 2020. But of course, right now, things get a little bit worse because Mars is in Aries, which squares Cancer. So we really can't do anything with the moon in Cancer without bringing in both malevolent planets. So hard pass. So for Mercury, he's going to be in Capricorn. No real essential dignity there to speak of, but one interesting thing to keep an eye on is that he is approaching the superior conjunction with the Sun, which we'll talk about more in our next lunation video when that is actually going to happen. Venus is going to move from Scorpio into Sagittarius, which will take a lot of pressure off of her moving out of her sign of detriment, but in Sagittarius, there's not really a whole lot of good for Venus there. She doesn't really particularly enjoy that sign. Again, later on, she's going to be approaching the conjunction of Jupiter, which will be an interesting time for those of us who have natal charts set up to take advantage of that. As for the Sun, he's just going to be in Capricorn. Whoop-de-doo. Mars has recently moved into his sign of Aries, which is great for Mars. Aries is one of his domiciles, but unfortunately, while Mars is in Aries, for the majority of the time, he'll be in square to Saturn. So this Mars in Aries period isn't going to see a lot of planetary Mars talismans just because of that Saturn interference. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Fortunately, our big good guy Jupiter is still in his domicile of Sagittarius. That's a really great placement for him, and Mars and Saturn are both kind of out of the way, so our opportunity for Jupiter talismans are still there, or at least, Jupiter petitions or Jupiter workings. So, keep a pin in that. That's very helpful. And again, we'll have the conjunction between Jupiter and Venus very soon. Finally, we get to Saturn, who's stuck in his domicile of Capricorn for a good while still. But unfortunately, through this period of time, that Mars square the Saturn-Mars square I mentioned earlier in Mars' segment is going to be affecting Saturn as well. So we're not going to really be able to use much of Saturn throughout this 2-week period. And that's just kind of how it goes sometimes. So with that all being said, let's go ahead and move into our elections for this period. I have 3 elections for you guys from January 5th to January 20th. They're all 3 Lunar Mansion talismans. One of them is going to be for North America, and then 2 of them are going to be for the Western Europe half. So let's go ahead and get into it. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. Here we can see the chart for our new moon time, or our solar eclipse, depending on how you want to phrase it. And this occurs at 15 degrees Capricorn and 25 minutes here. But let's go ahead and move on to our first election. Our syzygies aren't super important or exciting. Alrighty, so here we have our first election set for January 11th at 11:04 a.m. roughly, and this is a Western Europe chart, so in America we're going to have to miss this one somewhat. This election is for the 28th mansion of the moon. We've talked about the 28th mansion of the moon in previous videos. The big takeaway from the 28th mansion is that it's about accumulation or gathering together something. Traditionally, it's used to gather together fish. I think I've made that joke before. The idea would be you would make a talisman of the 28th mansion, and you would like throw it in a pond, and fish would kind of come together there, and you can just kind of, you know, throw your net out, and here you have yourself a big haul. Of course, because we are, you know, using magic here, we don't have to settle for fish. We don't have to focus on fish. We can use this to gather together kind of anything that we are looking for, whether it's opportunities or, you know, career advancement or the accomplishment of goals. These are all things that we could create a 28th mansion talisman for, to help us gather together and to choose from or to collect. It could even be used for something like wealth, or, you know, to find specific items. All of these could be great sort of differently tweaked applications of the 28th mansion of the moon. And the sort of the basic setup for Lunar Mansion talismans is employed here. Here we have the moon at 18 degrees Pisces, which is within the confines of the 28th mansion. The moon applies a sextile to the sun, which is, you know, always very helpful, especially because the sun is associated with selection and choosing. And so this configuration is a very nice connection between the moon, which is the planet of gathering together, and the sun, which is the planet of selecting and deciding and making choices. So you see how this kind of fits within the general theme or characteristic of the 28th mansion itself. This, you know, it's better even still. The Lord of the first house is Jupiter in his domicile, in the 9th house, unafflicted by Saturn or Mars. So all in all, it's just a really good, solid, kind of safe election, which are sometimes kind of rare. Alrighty, so moving into our second election, this one is for the North American continent, so that group should be able to get some use out of this. And this is actually an election for the first mansion of the moon. This is one that we've also talked about before. The first mansion of the moon is used to initiate, to begin, to light a fire under you, to get yourself going on something, on any sort of project or goal. You know, maybe something you've kind of been letting sit on the back burner for a long time, not really committed to. This is really the sort of magical push that you need to get yourself to do that. And here this chart features the moon in the first mansion, which ends at 12 degrees and 51 minutes of Aries. And the moon applies a conjunction with Mars in Aries here. Typically, this would be considered kind of a malefic configuration. You don't usually want the moon conjoined Mars, but the moon is in Aries. Mars receives Aries. Mars very much has that nature of the first mansion as well, that very go-get, initiating kind of thing. So all of this kind of fits within the energy or the narrative that we're building with the election talisman itself. Here we've got the Lord of the first house is the moon, and the 10th house conjoined Mars, which is a little meh, you know, like I said before, but even then we have the reception. The one thing about this chart that I would potentially give pause to and just, you know, maybe take a second to reconsider, is that it is still conjoined, or it is still squared the Saturn here in Capricorn, and this could be difficult energy to deal with. This could be sort of like a false start kind of thing. So just one thing to stay aware of, this Mars moon conjunction here within the first mansion is very powerful and very helpful for, you know, lighting a fire under you and getting yourself going, getting yourself motivated for something. But then this square of Saturn is very much like an immediate brick wall. So it's important to gauge how much you can use that. I tried to do my best with this, and luckily we do have Saturn cadent in the 6th house, so Saturn is depowered somewhat, while the moon and Mars are very angular and powerful, but this is still something that is going to have to be dealt with. So, you know, potentially something useful here, but, you know, just be careful with this. Alrighty, So our our final talismanic election for this 2 week period is going to be another Western Europe chart. This one for the fifth mansion of the moon, which I don't think is one that we've talked about, but is actually really kind of cool. And I'm really kind of jealous that I'm not going to be able to use this talisman. So the fifth mansion of the moon is really more about gaining knowledge or wisdom, or, you know, kind of like the divine spark of insight that answers your question or walks you through a problem. It can be really great for self-reflective work. You know, why am I doing this to myself? What am I getting out of this? To help you kind of get through self-destructive habits, or, you know, things that aren't serving you anymore, to kind of help you understand and get to the root of a problem. The fifth mansion is very good for. Like I said, this is for Western Europe, so North America is not going to get it. But here we have the moon in the first house, conjoined the angle here in the fifth mansion. And the moon's next aspect is a trine to the sun at 26 degrees Capricorn. This is really kind of fantastic for a fifth mansion talisman, primarily because the sun is seen as sort of the astrology equivalent of divinity. So, you know, the sun sees all, the sun knows all, and the moon being able to aspect the sun in a talisman that's about understanding, getting clarity, information, learning is very, very appropriate. And having the moon and the sun both on angles at the same time is another really great bonus to this one. There's just a lot about this chart that's very nice. The lord of the first house in this chart is Venus, who is placed here in the seventh. She's unafflicted by either malefic, a trine to Mars, and is conjoined with Jupiter. She's very well taken care of in the sign of Sagittarius. And this is another really great kind of safe and effective talisman that I would recommend anybody having the opportunity to do, to be able to do it. So I went ahead and kind of went back to the North American continent to do a sort of equivalent chart for the fifth mansion talisman that Western Europe had, just to kind of show what the problems were and then kind of let you decide whether or not you wanted to move forward with it. For this election specifically, one of our main issues, is that by the time the moon gets up to the ascendant, close to the ascendant, she's already passed the trine of the sun. So you can see here the moon's at 26 degrees and 19 minutes of Taurus, and the sun is at 26 degrees and 20 minutes of Capricorn. So, like, you know, exactly conjoining like 4 minutes later, and we've missed it, it's past. And after that, the moon comes to the opposition of Venus, and which is not really as appropriate, or really very appropriate at all for this kind of working. So that's a problem. We've lost the moon's angularity, which makes it less potent. That might not necessarily be a deal breaker for some of you, so that's fine. But the real deal breaker for this, to me, is that by doing this, what we've done now is we've put Venus, the lady of the first house, conjoin the eighth house cusp, which isn't really a place that I want to see the lord of the first house be placed in different kinds of more positive elections. There are ways to weave the eighth house signification into the talisman in a way that can be effective and useful. Like if you're wanting to get, you know, information from the spirits of the dead, you know, get back in contact with family that has since passed, anything like that. If you can weave kind of that eighth house influence in it in a very positive way, knock yourself out. The lord of the first being in the eighth can be very useful. If you want to use the election to sort of get insight on anxiety or like destructive behaviors, the eighth house makes sense there. Like, you know, the first house shows what we're seeking. So the lord of the first and the eighth, we're seeking, you know, anxiety, or, you know, we're seeking insight into those things. So in that way, this election can still be very helpful, but otherwise kind of not. I don't really recommend it. Alrighty guys, so those are the 3 elections that I had to share with you. Hopefully by now you're kind of getting more of the gist of electing for magical purposes, sort of knowing what to look out for. There are a lot of different things that you can do. Obviously this video focused more on the lunar mansions because that's all we had. There weren't really any good fixed star elections for one reason or another. And I don't really do much with decanic work, even though that's something that I might do more in the future. But there are other ways that you can mix in astrology and magic to get more out of your spiritual practice. And hopefully by watching more of these and kind of following along with the tips or making them yourselves, you can get more and more into the habit of doing it, or more familiar with the rules as they're kind of laid out to us in the tradition. So with all that being said, I will see you guys for the Leo full moon on January 20th. Take care until then.